Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Hi, my name is Ken. I'm an alcoholic. Glad to be here in LAUGHLIN. I was sitting looking at the people that are here, and there's just so many folks that I know from San Diego. It's like being in your own hometown, so to speak, and doing a meeting. I don't know what it is, but they always have me speak after people who are particularly brilliant. And I don't know whether they just like to show me up or what, but this afternoon they had Patty, and Patty, who I've known for a number of years, shares that she got through San Diego State with a 3.8 average. Well, I want you to know that I got through high school totally unscarred by education. It never landed a blow, I always tried to hang out with people who were just like me, not very bright, And I learned very young, and I was born and raised in New York, and I learned very young street smart stuff that if you hang out with people who are stupider than you, then your own stupidity and insanity goes almost unnoticed, So I'm part of that realm of alcoholics who are sober and not particularly brilliant. So if you fall into that category, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. We're glad you're here. I hung out with guys, you say, there's a dead bird. We look up, Guys I went through school with thought that Moby Dick was a venereal disease, they just didn't know, I remember going into a trophy shop in AA with a buddy of mine back in the city, and we were getting trophies for the bowling team, and he looked around and he says, "Wow, is this guy good?" So that gives you an idea, very intellectual kind of guys. I've been part of conversations that went something like this. Tony, if your mother didn't have any children, there's a good chance you won't, And what you guys are doing right now is one of the reasons I love to come to Alcoholics Anonymous. I love to hear people laugh. I just really enjoy hearing them laugh. And I know a couple of things about laughter that most people don't know. First of all, you cannot laugh and think at the same time. So every time you're laughing, you're getting a break from your favorite topic, which is you, If there were a karaoke song for AA, it would be, I am always on my mind, I am always, The whole deal is we are so self-centered. It's just amazing to me. And the nice part about hearing people laugh is the fact that not only they're not thinking, but it's a very helpful thing. Because as you are laughing, your body is producing all these things which give you more oxygen and help you fight off disease and just makes you healthier. In fact, the American Medical Association says that laughing and sex produce the same amount of endorphins. I'm alcoholic, My deal is why not have both? If you can laugh during sex, those babies would be a pumping and a pumping and a pumping, And at my age, laughter during sex is pretty good. All you got to do is start disrobing, You look in the mirror and you say, "When the hell did that happen?" You almost want to ask yourself, "Did you get a license number? I mean, what hit you?" So So as you move past your 40s, your 50s, and your 60s, and you start getting into your 70s and your 80s, you know, you begin to notice a lot more of you that you didn't know before, you know, like, and if you're not laughing, you should be, you know, like, because there's a lot to be laughed at, you know. I sponsor a lot of guys, and it's an amazing thing to me that some of them are, particularly the guys who are newer, you know, they get hung up about making mistakes. You know, we are living in an era right now, and it has nothing to do with politics. It just has to do with the era we're living in. It's like living in the middle of a tsunami of bullshit. You know, like, every day somebody tries to give you more bullshit than you had yesterday. You know, like, and you're looking at them saying, you know, if I was into bullshit, I'd listen. You know, like, you know. But it's amazing, and everybody is so on edge, particularly at the airport. You know, it was nice driving over here with Carol because, you know, we drove. You know, we didn't take our shoes off and all that kind of stuff, you know. Now there was a cartoon in the paper the other day after this guy with the latest tsunami. And these two guys were standing in line at the airport, and they had their underwear in their hand. And they said, remember when we thought shoes was a big deal? You know, And that's just the way it is. I mean, you gotta really stay on top of this stuff. It's everywhere. I was behind a woman at the airport a couple of months ago, and actually, I was behind a guy. And nothing against weight. I'm not trying to be snippy here, but the guy had to weigh at least 350 pounds. And he had his luggage, and he went up, and he weighed his luggage, and it weighed in at 49 pounds. And the lady said, "You're 1 pound underneath, so you're okay." So then this woman in front of me, who looked like she could have been from Biafra, you know, like if she weighed 100 pounds, she was overweight. And she got up there and her luggage weighed 52 pounds, and they wanted her to pay $100. You know, like the lady said, "You're 2 pounds over, miss. It's going to cost you $100. And I don't know why. I love to get in the middle of that stuff, you know, like, you know. I'm the kind of guy, if I see a loose thread, it's like, yeah, let's see how deep it goes, you know? You know? And I just grew up that way. I always had that kind of edge, you know. My mom used to say, "You are no day at the beach, drunk or sober." And she was absolutely right, because I was born spring-loaded, you know, like I'm ready to anytime, you know. And I remember getting up there to the little gal. And I was laughing, and she said, "What are you laughing at?" I said, "That guy before this woman had to weigh at least 350 pounds. With his luggage, he had to be weighing in about 400 pounds. She was weighing in at 152 and had to pay extra money." And she says, "Are you making a complaint?" I said, "No, I'm making an observation, you know, and I'm surprised you can't make that observation. I mean, if this plane goes down, what the hell's the newspaper going to say is that 2 pounds for that lady put these guys with Sully on the Hudson River, you know, like, come on, you know." I listen to people in this stuff today. It's like watching people milk a mouse, you know. A lot of activity, but very little milk, you know, like, you know, like you say, "Yeah, you just don't know how bad it is," you know. I had a guy the other day, he made Job look like a lotto winner, you know, like a newcomer, you know. He was telling me all this nonsense, and I'm looking at him, and he says, "Yeah." And I said, you know, sometimes you got to just bring a guy like that up out of the depths, you know. So I looked at him, and I said, "You're a pretty lucky guy." And he said, "How do you figure that?" I said, "You know, when your dad climaxed, he shot about 250,000 sperm to fertilize one egg. You're the winner, you know, like you're the winner, you know, like, you're a 250,000 to one shot coming out of the chute, you know, like, how in the hell can you be upset about anything, you know?" And you just look at people sometimes and you wonder, how can you be depressed? You know, like, yeah, I lost my job. Well, a couple of years ago, he couldn't even spell job. You know, like, and you know, like, And now you lost something you didn't even know what it was, you know, like, and so you only, you know, weepers and whiners, you know, you say, give it a break, you know. And sometimes the only way these folks could complain more, you know, is if they talked, you know, like everything is a complaint. The whole world is about what isn't working out. And that's why I loved Alcoholics Anonymous, you know. I grew up, my dad died when I was young, and my mom had 7 kids. I was the youngest. You know, and I don't know about the heredity part of this program, but in my family, you're either in AA or you need it. You know, there's no middle ground at all, you know. My mom, the only time she would have a half a glass of beer was when we had spaghetti. My dad could drink a keg of beer while she was making it. So, you know, like, so it was just that way, you know. And she used to look at us kids and she'd say, you know, the only time you kids say no to a drink is if you misunderstood the question, you know, like, you know. And she used to hold up beer and read the ingredients and say, I don't know what they put in here that makes you act so stupid, you know. But I was always a thinker. I was always ahead of the game in thinking. You know, I just had a mind. My mom used to walk through the living room, and if I was sitting there thinking, she'd say, turn on that TV. I don't want you thinking, you know, because I could really get into it, you know. I was like one of those people. I was sent to a psychiatrist in high school because I had some anger issues, and hard to believe, such a nice guy. And I remember the psychiatrist looking at me and he said, what are you thinking right now? And I made something up, and he looked at me and said, that's not what you're thinking. What are you thinking right now? And I made something else up. And finally he said a third time, what are you thinking right now? Now what I was thinking right at that moment is, if my knees bent the other way, what would chairs look like? And somehow I knew I didn't want to share this with him, you know, like, you know, otherwise you guys would have a whole different speaker tonight, you know, like, it would be like, wow, where did that come from, you know? But I was always that kind of a guy. I mean, I was newly sober, and my sponsor said, what are you going to do for a living? I said, I'm going to do telemarketing. He said, telemarketing? Oh, good, you're going to sell stuff. What are you going to sell? I said, I'm going to sell hearing aids. He said, you're going to sell hearing aids on the telephone? It sounded so good, I thought the market would be immense, you know, like nobody else was doing it, you know, but I was one of those guys who could be right in the middle of a bad idea and have a worse one overtake it, you know. And then I'd go with both of them, you know, like, and try to see how it turned out. But the nice part about me was that when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was so ready for this thing. I was living with my mom in a senior citizen place, you know. And she got a notice saying that I had to get out because I wasn't a senior citizen, you know. And I had been there so long I could use the walker, you know, like I was getting really good at the walker in my mom's senior citizen. And she said, you know, you have to get out. So I knew that something had to happen. My wife and my kids had moved out of state, you know, to save their own sanity. My wife used to look at me. My ex-wife was so normal. I mean, Normal, normal. You know, she'd have an answer that would just, for an alcoholic, it would just stun you. It's like a stun gun, you know. I remember saying to her one time, I came home from the city and I was on the subway and I got home and I started drinking some shooters, and she said, what's going on? And I said, the stock market had its worst day in the history of the stock market. And she looked at me and she said, we don't own any stock, you know. How can you converse with someone like that? I mean, like, you know, like, she would just say the most normal things, you know, and, you know, and it was like, she'd take you back, you know. She was from a rural area, and then I moved her into the city, and she never got the pace of the city, you know. The pace of the city was very different. I grew up in an all-Italian neighborhood. You know, there was no mafia, but if there was, it was my neighborhood, you know, like, you know. It was one of those neighborhoods where you say, how far is it to the subway? And we say, we don't know. No one's ever made it. You know, like, you know, they used to say things like, you know, he fell asleep in the trunk of a car. He deserved to be shot. You know, like, this was the mentality of the guys you're hanging out with, you know. And there I was in the midst of that. I don't know. Everything that happens today in the news, I relate to. When Bush was in, we had the weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I related that to the bars I used to drink in. You know, every bar I drank in had weapons of mass destruction. You know, and I thought, God must really like us. He gives us such good games. You know, we had shuffleboard. You know, you have metal weights being tossed by people who are totally out of their minds drunk, you know. And then if shuffleboard wasn't the deal in your bar, they had pool tables. You got a stick, I got a stick. Let's play, you know. None of those things impressed me, none. I was a dart man. I loved darts. Because my darts, towards the end of the evening, would develop a consciousness of their own. You know, I would hurl them out into the air, and not knowing where they were going to end up, you know. And in this one bar I drank in, there was a little break front going into the men's room. And my brother, I had brothers who could drink and drink and drink and drink. And the more they drank, the better they got at darts. My brother became almost robotic. You know, and my darts were like, hey, you know, I had the flippin' darts. They went everywhere, you know. And we were shooting these darts, and I was to the flippin' stage of my dart throwing. And this guy was walking into the bathroom, and I threw my dart. And it went right in his leg, you know. And my brother looked at me very casual, as he often did. He was 10 years old, and he said, we need the dart, you know. So I followed the guy into the urinal, and while he's doing his business, I said, excuse me, and I get down and I pull the dart out of his leg. He says, thanks, you know, and we get back to playing darts, you know. I mean, those are the kind of things that happen, you know. And like, if you didn't have those kind of things, you're really missing out, you know, like. And I noticed that there were people here tonight had 6 months. How many of you are there? There was a number of you. Just raise your hand. Just good. I want to welcome you to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm sure glad you're here along with your parents, your neighbors, your friends, and everybody else. You know, they're really glad you're here too. But you're going to hear a lot of stuff in AA about the promises. But there's some early promises I want to get to you because this will keep you going for a while. You're going to notice after a couple of days of being sober and trying to do the right thing, that folks are going to start to wave to you using all their fingers. You know, they're going to be so happy for you, you know. You know, and friends and family are going to let you start to handle children, even on hardwood floors. You know, like it's like, yeah, take the baby. Oh, yeah, you know. Yeah. And people will expect you to bring home the milk and the bread when you say you're going to bring it home. And you'll learn a whole nuance for going to the bathroom. I mean, you'll actually know what to snip and what not to snip. You know, like you're going to get really good at a lot of things you lost skills at before. And then there's a lighter stuff that goes on. You're going to hear a lot of stuff in the first year. And you're going to have a lot of people who tell you what Alcoholics Anonymous is about. And we have a big book. You know, I like to call it the owner's manual. You know, anything that goes wrong, you should be able to find it in the owner's manual. You're going to have a lot of well-meaning people tell you stuff that is not in the owner's manual. You know, so when they tell you anything, the first question you want to say is, would you do me a favor? I'm trying to stay sober here. Would you show me where that is in the literature? You know? And if it's not in the literature, it's not AA. Now, don't get me wrong. These people are not trying to hurt you. They just don't know. You know? You'll hear things like, no sex in the first year. Whoa, you know, I just gave up the biggest thing in my life. Now you want me to give up number 2? You know, like, hey. And there's nothing like that in the big book. And did you ever see those people who go the whole year? Oh, my God. You know? Oh, my God. You know, they look like a chihuahua trying to pass a peach pit. You know, they're like all over the place. You know? You say, hey, is that your face or you're just in agony? You know, like... But the deal is that it's an amazing thing to observe here. So make sure you get the right stuff. And I'm going to tell you something because you might as well hear it from me because it's the truth. And that is during the first year, you're going to think that other people are laughing at you. And you're going to be absolutely right, you know. And the reason we're laughing is not at your problems, it's at your solutions. You know, like, you guys are great. You know, like, the hamster's dead, but the wheel is still, you know, snapping around there, you know. When I finally came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had been in a bar, and I had gotten a barroom facial. I had questioned somebody's ancestry. And I showed up at the meeting. It was the 5th of July, 1970. And this was my first AA meeting. And I walked into the meeting and the guy at the door said, "Newcomer." And I'm thinking, how does he know that? My lip is busted. I got a black eye. I'm wearing a wool suit. And I think, is this where you get something? Yeah. And he said, "Yeah, come on in." And he gave me a little red name tag, and he takes me down the stairs of this church. And then he says the most unbelievable thing to me. He says, "If you want to feel the miracle, sit up front." I'm going, "Oh, yeah, I want the miracle, all right. This is, put me up front where the miracle is, you know." So I sat through the meeting, and when it was over, one of the guys said to me, "You want to go to the diner with us?" And I said, "Sure." I didn't have too much on my agenda. And we went over to the diner, and they had a specially built diner for newcomers. You know, they had a booth in there that once you got in, other people would fill in behind you, you know. You didn't get to go home until everybody gets to go home, you know. You and the waitress are doing your sideboard work when they're closing the diner, you know. And I sat there, and the guys I was with 2 plumbers, I was with a lawyer, a priest, and a guy from the FBI. And I thought, this is amazing. This is what my drinking has led me to. I mean, like, Jesus. You know, you'd think you'd catch a break somewhere along the line, you know. But here I was with these guys. And so the plumber said to me, one plumber said to me, "I'm going to be your temporary sponsor." And he just died a couple of years ago, so he was my temporary sponsor for 37 years, you know. Now, you had to catch this guy, you know. He used to be a boxer before they invented mouthpieces and helmets and stuff. And he had this twitch, you know. And he smoked these cigarillo cigars, you know. They were like, I think he picked them up off of dead people. And he never could keep his head and his body looking at you while he was talking to you, you know. And he had a head that looked like it had already worn out 2 bodies. And I thought, geez, I'm going good here now, you know. And so he said, "I'm going to be a temporary sponsor, you know." So he had me start coming over his house because he knew I was on my own, and he knew if I was left alone, I was going to be totally insane. So he said, "Come on over the house and you have a meal, and then we go to the meeting." So I started doing that on a real regular basis, almost every day, going over his house and getting a meal, and then we'd go to the meeting. And after about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks in that area, one night I'm there, and the phone rings. And he looks at me, and I got to tell you that he was the guy who owned a 9-passenger station wagon. They just come out with the 9-passenger station wagons in '70. And the back seat faced out the back, you know. So there was another guy, Fast Eddie and me. We always had to sit in the back seat, looking out the back. And when everybody got in the car, we'd get in the back. You know, the door would open, and we'd look. And it was like looking out at the exhaust, you know. And I said to him one night, "How come I got to sit in the back seat?" He said, "I want you to see the wreckage of your past." You know, like, so I was going through this for 3 weeks, sitting in the back seat, me and Fast Eddie. Fast Eddie was great because, you know, he was the kind of guy that was out there where the buses don't run, you know, and you could talk to him, you know, like, you'd ask him, like, what kind of a day it is, and he'd say, the 8th, You know, like he had a brevity to him that you hardly ever see in the city. And he just didn't know a whole lot, but he knew he didn't know a whole lot, but he didn't mind sharing with you he didn't know a whole lot. And we were sitting looking out the back, and we'd go through these meetings. But this night, the phone rings, and my sponsor gets off the phone. I never saw him so happy and excited. He said, "We got a 12-step call." I said, 12-step call? He said, "Yeah, come on, we're going on a 12-step call." I said, "Oh, good, 12-step call." I had no idea what a 12-step call was. So we go out to the car. I head around the back, and he said, "No, sit up here, D." Whoa, ho, whoa, ho, ho, ho. This is starting to pay off already. I'm going to see what we're going to hit now. You know, like so I get in a car with him, and we go, and we pull up to this brownstone in the city, and he says, "You can't find a parking space." And he says to me, "D, can you go get this guy?" I said, "Hey, you know, I'm alcoholic. I'm not retarded. You know, I can go get a guy. I'll go ring the doorbell and get the guy." He said, "Right." He said, "I'm going to drive around the block, and when I come back, I'll pick you up. We'll take this guy to a meeting, and we'll get him sober. Right, D?" Yeah, that's what we're doing. So as he tells the story, he goes off, goes around the block, and when he comes back, I have the guy on the ground, and I'm beating him with a garbage can lid. Sometime between this guy making the call and us getting there, he had what's called a second thought, you know, which I have since come to find out he was entitled to, but I didn't know it at that time, you know. All I knew is this is the first thing anybody asked me to do in AA. I wasn't going to let them down, you know. And I'll tell you, you know, and I don't want to make this sound like crazy. I didn't beat the guy to death. I hit him maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 times tops, you know. And after the third time, I could tell this guy was willing to turn his life over to me. He had a look like, "Don't do that again, please," you know. And his wife was in one of those, you know, before AA, Al-Anon wardrobes. You know, she had a house coat on with a double knot in it, and she's, please, you know. So he whistles me to the car like a canine. And, you know, I've been hanging out with him so long now, I got a little twitch, you know. So we get in the car, and I'm twitching, and he's twitching. And he says, "I want you to do me a favor." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Don't ever consider that a 12-step call." He said, "And don't tell anybody I'm your sponsor for a while. You know, like, you know, let's see how this thing works out, you know." But whenever I would challenge him on anything, he would look me in the eye as best he could, and he'd say, "If you want what I have." And I did, you know, I did. I wanted what he had. He had a home where his wife and his kids lived in the same place, you know. I had always gotten in trouble. I mean, before I got to AA, I had trouble with the law. It seems that I was finding things before people officially lost them. And, you know, and when you first get arrested, they just come out with that Miranda stuff, you know, and the cop would say to you, "You have the right to remain silent." I never had the ability, you know. I always felt if you could just talk a little bit, we could straighten this out, you know. And I heard Patty share today about, you know, drunk and assault, you know, like assaulting the police. You know, I would always get in the back of the car. Now, those of you who have 6 months or less, this is very critical for you, because there's a chance that maybe 1 or 2 of you may go out and drink again, and this will help you. When you are in the back of a police car, handcuffed and going to jail, the best thing to do is try to bring some levity to the situation. You know, have a good joke ready for the cops. They love good jokes. My best joke was this. I used to say, you know, what's the difference between an elephant and a police car? And the guy would say, "I don't know. What's the difference between an elephant and a police car?" I said, "Well, with an elephant, the trunk's in the front and the asshole's in the back, you know." I always always appeared in court with a thing across my forehead, you know, like, because they can either help you in or not help you in, you know. But the deal is, and I'll tell you, that was a car stopper joke, you know. Almost every time you'd hear the brakes, you know. But the deal is that's basically how I got here. And then I went to this meeting. I went up front. You know, I met my sponsor. And then my sponsor started taking me through the big book. And the way he took me through the steps of the big book is, this is going to sound unbelievably impossible, just the way they are in the big book. We didn't go to seminars. We didn't have additional reading material. We didn't have opinions anonymous. You know, we went through the steps just the way they were. And as we went through each step, I was evicted from my hiding places. Slowly, my hiding places were just being taken away from me. And for the first time in my entire life, I had a chance to look at reality. Now, don't get me wrong. I used to do drive-bys to reality. You know, hey, there's reality. You know, but I never wanted to stop there because I always thought it was too confusing. You know, people in reality seem to be under a lot of duress. You know, my idea about life is, hey, you know, if you can't take a joke, you know, anyway. So the deal is that, and I always felt that, you know, you had to be able to say something clever because that's how you grew up. I understood the part of the big book that says we share our experience, strength, and hope. Because I grew up on the streets of New York. And in the streets of New York, they used to say, when a man with experience meets a man with money, the guy with the experience will end up with the money. And the guy who had the money will end up with an experience, you know. So we always knew about the experience part of things. And it's not about trying to get someone to see something a certain way. It's allowing them to understand that they're spending a lot of time looking for what they already have. You know, Carl Jung is one of our guys. And Carl Jung worked with Roland. And Carl Jung was a very unique guy at that time because, you know, initially Roland's family wanted to send him to Sigmund Freud. Could you imagine if that had worked out? You know? Can you imagine? So what did your daddy do? You know? But Carl Jung was really good because he believed basically that every man had a soul. And he believed that through a spiritual explosion, people could go through a catharsis of growing and learning that they couldn't do any other way. And he coined a lot of words for psychology, the terms we use, introvert, extrovert, collective consciousness, archetype. That all comes from Carl Jung. But the word I like the best that he gave us is synchronicity. Synchronicity. Now, synchronicity means that there's a meaningful occurrence that is so beyond the realm of probability that it probably has to be in an ether outside of our own. You know, it has to be something else. Marion last night was talking about be still and know that I am God. You know, think of the world we live in today, how difficult it is to be still. Think of what we have, you know. It used to be a guy gave you a business card, and if it had his name on it, it was a lot. Then it had his name and his company. Today it has fax numbers, cell numbers, you know. It had an email. You say, how much contact do we need? You know, where's the be still part? You know, how do you be still when you spend your whole day being connected to nonsense? You know, I have to get all the jokes on email. I don't have email, and I operate just fine. Now, I know some of you need it for business, but it's like I now remember reading about Carl Jung. When he appeared on television in the 50s, he died in 61, but when he appeared on television in the mid-50s, they asked him if he believed in God. And his response to that was, no, I don't believe in God. I know God. I know God. And each and every person in this room has had that synchronicity. At some point, at some moment in your life, you, as the 12 and 12 says, you'll get a glimpse of God's ultimate reality, His ultimate reality. That's the purest sense of God. the pure essence of it. And when you do, you'll just know it. Now, does it stay with you? Unfortunately, not for most of us. But the fact is, you get that brush with it. And that brush is so important. And that synchronicity. I've had things of synchronicity happen in my life. I moved from New York to California in a geographic. And when I got out there, my sponsor made me promise that I'd go to a church for 6 months. He said, I don't care what kind of church you go to. He said, but go to a church. He said, you've never been to California. You don't know where you're going to live. You don't know where you're going to work. And it's ironic. The guy in the room tonight was the guy who hired me when I moved out to California. I mean, is this a small world or what? That was in 74. There's Patrick sitting over there. So the deal is that I moved to San Diego knowing no one, not knowing whether I was going to stay there or not, but just going to try to move up the coast and find out where we could live. And he said to me, my sponsor said to me, you'll know when you're in the right place. You'll just have a real resonance that this is where I belong. So I was raised Catholic. I have nothing against the Catholic Church, but I had stopped going. So I thought, well, I'm familiar with that. I'll go to the Catholic Church. So in LaMESA on El Cajon Boulevard, there's a Catholic church, and it's called St. Martin's. So I go to St. Martin's, and there's an Irish priest saying the Mass, and after the Mass they have donuts in the rectory, and I go over to the rectory, and I'm sitting there, and this priest walks over, and in his Irish brogue says, are you going to be living in the parish, lad? And I said, I don't know yet, Father. We're looking around. And he says, well, where are you coming from? And I told him, he said, oh, it's a long way. He said, I came here from Ireland, It's a long way, New York. And he says, are you going to buy a house or rent a house? I said, well, we can't afford to buy anything, but we'd like to rent if we could. And so he said, come on over to the rectory. He said, and I'll give you a card for a guy, and maybe he can help you. By the way, let me introduce myself. My name is Bill Wilson. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. My name is Bill Wilson. Okay. Your name is Bill Wilson. So then we go over the rectory, and he hands me this little real estate thing, and it says, Bob Smith Realty. Now, I got through school unscarred by education, but I'm pretty quick in some areas, And I'm thinking, Bill Wilson and Bob Smith. That Father Bill came into AA 2 years later. Got to speak all over the country because everybody wanted an Irish priest by the name of Bill Wilson who was in recovery. But that's just what happened. I met this guy. That's just what happened. When this legal stuff came up when I was newly sober, I had to go to Kings County Courthouse. And I had to go to see an attorney there with 260 some attorneys in Brooklyn at that time. And I go into this meeting, and there was a guy who my sponsor hung out with. I wanted this guy to be my sponsor because he had a Cadillac. And back in the 70s, a Cadillac was still the status symbol. And I thought, Tommy's got a Cadillac. So I'd asked him to be my sponsor. He said, no, I'm only here a few months ahead of you. You stick with this guy. He's going to be good for you. And so when I went to the Kings County Courthouse, who's sitting behind the desk but Tommy? And he looks at me and he said, I didn't know you did this. I said, I sure as hell didn't know you did this when we were sharing and riding around. I didn't know that. Synchronicity. He said, let me get the detective who's handling the case and see what we can do. So he calls this guy in. Detective, all in New York. Guy comes in. I played high school football and basketball with him. He said, Ken, if you work with us on this, I'll work with you. If you lie about it, I'm going to walk away because I don't want to be the guy to put you down. We worked that thing out. And we worked it out. It was all finances. And for the next 22 years, I made payments on my past. And synchronicity just worked out that way. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. If you ever count the the letters in be still and know that I am God, it's 24. 12 steps, 12 traditions. Where does that saying come from? It comes from the Psalms, 46:1. 4 and 6 are 10 and 1 is 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to form a conscious contact with God as I understand Him. Synchronicity. Synchronicity everywhere once you get out of the way of the... You know? Once you get out of the way of that, you start to have some good stuff. And you realize that life is happening just the way it's supposed to. Before I moved out to California, I was going to these meetings and I couldn't understand why they always knew I was a newcomer, because I wasn't in a blue suit anymore and the black eye had gone away and my mouth had gone down, the swelling had gone down. But they always seemed to know. And then one night I'm at the meeting, about 2 months sober, and I'm looking around the room and I noticed that everybody in the room has a blue name tag. I have a red name tag. So after the meeting, I jump up to the secretary. Hey, yo. I was good at hey, yo then. Hey, yo. How come everybody's got a blue name tag and I got a red name tag? He said, D, you're ready for a blue one. Took it off, put it on, and he said, go get him, Tiger. And I walked away from that desk where he was, and I'm thinking, you know what? It's hard to slip anything by me. I'm pretty much tuned in here. It's pretty hard to slip anything by me. And the deal is that my whole life has been synchronicity. We were talking at dinner time about hospice. In 1983, I signed up for hospice, to volunteer in hospice. I thought it would be a good thing. I had retired. I had a company and I sold it to an insurance company, and they were going to pay me a pension for the rest of my life. And I thought, wow, this is great. This is great. I had gone through a divorce and I had custody of my 2 kids. When I say custody, they wanted to live with me. And I got to be a single parent for 4 or 5 years. And so the deal was that synchronicity was working out all over the place. And the reality of this is that little did I know in that hospice deal that I thought I was going to be doing something besides AA. I didn't know I was going to be doing more AA. God loves to do bank shots sometimes just to show off. He leads you to believe you're doing this. You go ahead, frolic over here. And you go over there, and then he does the bank shot, and you get whiplash. Like, what the heck happened there? And you're going in a whole other direction. And as it turned out, in 1993, my son got AIDS. And he came home to live with me. And he ended up in that hospice. And I got to be there for him for the last 3 months of his life. And I got to understand synchronicity, what life is about. It's about right now. There's a phrase in the big book that we read it just so every day I think we just get immune to its potency. And that is, there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. You take the word now and you spell it backwards, it's one. W-O-N. When you've learned to live in the now, you've won. That's where life is lived. And if you're feeling the spiritual malady, you're not living in the now. You're trying to live in the past or the future. You're over there. I didn't get it. There's only 2 kinds of unhappy people in this world. Those who get what they want and those who don't. That's it. In AA, there's only 2 kinds of people. Those that do the work and those that take the credit. Try to get in the first group. There's a lot less competition. But the deal is you just realize how every minute of every day is built in with synchronicity or God, whatever you want to call it. And I remember my son having to crawl to the bathroom because he didn't want to have a bedpan. And he went from 190 pounds down to about 110, 112 pounds. And I put comforters and pillows on the floor so he could crawl and maintain his dignity. And as he was crawling one day, I realized I crawled on the floor and lost my dignity. My son was crawling on the floor to maintain his dignity. And when he died in hospice, he said to me, I'm good to go, Dad. Everything is okay. I'm good to go. And at that time in 1993, when he said that, 29 years old, I said to myself, from this day forward, I'm going to be good to go. I'm going to spend every minute of my time to the best of my ability trying to live in this now with God as I understand Him and try to be of service to other people. You know, in the tsunami of bullshit that we hear, there's a lot of financial stuff. You know, all I can tell you is I came into this world with nothing, and I still have most of it. You know, like, you know. And I found out that you can be abundant without owning anything. All you have to do is be ready to do service work. And life takes on a whole different meaning. You know, we're doing things for the right reason, not for the wrong reason. And you get in touch with everything. You know, I used to have a terrible fear of dogs. And the reason I had that fear of dogs is because I was bit 6, 7 times. And I don't take tetanus well. I break out in hives. So, and the reason I was bit by these dogs is they were trying to keep me out of places that I was trying to get into. And so I have a real appreciation for dogs. And when I was sober a couple of years ago, I was driving down the road in San Diego, and I looked in my side view mirror, and here's this Rottweiler chasing after my car. And I'm thinking, wow. So I immediately pulled over. I don't know if you know what a Rottweiler. It's like a Doberman on steroids. You know, like it's this huge dog, you know. And this dog came slopping up to the side of the car and was, and I rolled down the window and I said, hey, take it easy. I'm right here, you know. And I looked at that dog, and that dog looked at me. And just for that moment, me and that dog were on the same wavelength. That dog intuitively knew that I had chased after a lot of shit in my life, having no idea what I was going to do when I caught it. But he also knew I knew the same thing about him, you know. So we kind of just looked at each other, and I said, catch your breath. I'm in no hurry, you know, like a... And then as I pulled away, I said, you know, hang in there, you know. Maybe a Volkswagen or something will come along, something you can handle, you know. And that's the way it is. You get in touch with everything. There's nothing you're not in touch with. You know, I sponsor a guy right now who's very involved in carrying the message in Iran. You know, Iran, you know. In the city of Mashhad, one of the holiest cities over there, there are now 16 AA meetings. Men and women go to the mosque where they can't go to pray, but they can go there for AA meetings together. You know, this thing is amazing. You know, you're playing with the big guy. You know, I remember when my dad died, my mom needed money, and I started to run numbers. And the deal is that I remember this guy. His name was Vinny. I don't know why. It was Vinny or Tony. You know. And all the guys I knew was named A Tony, A Vinny, A Nicky, you know. And I said to this guy, Vinny, I said, do you believe in God? He said, sure. I said, do you think that people actually can go to hell? He looked at me. He looked at me like I'd grown another head. And he said, D, you worked for me now a couple of years. I said, yeah. He said, do we ever lose? I said, well, someday. No, I'm not talking about someday, somebody. Do we ever lose? And I said, no, we never lose. He said, you think God's going to invent a game where he loses? God is in such hot pursuit of all of us that none of us get away. You know, he's just toying with us until we get the light. You know, but the deal is that in the meantime, he expects you to be happy, joyous, and free, and not going around trying to figure this thing out. Life is baked, you know, if you break it down to the simplest form, it's like a Monopoly game. You try to go around the board, not screw around on other people's property, get to go, pick up $200, continue on. You know, don't go to jail. Try to do some community service once in a while. And, you know, just basically mind your own business. You know, But you got to learn in the game that you're not the top hat. You know, in life, you're not anchored to be in the top hat or the rabbit. You know, that's just the game. It's what we do to keep busy while we're doing the real stuff. The real stuff is all internalized. It's all the stuff we do that makes us who we are, the very essence of who we are. And then you get to enjoy life. No matter what's going on, you're having a good laugh. I mean, I was going to Dallas about 2 years ago, and I was getting on the plane, and I very seldom, if ever, get upgraded. But I had some deal with American, and they said we could upgrade you. So they put me in first class. I mean, I think I own the world when I'm in first class, you know. I'm like, would you mind if I have another water, please? I fit in so naturally, like a turd in a punch bowl, So I'm in there in first class, and I'm getting ready to get on the plane, and this guy gets on the plane who's from AA in San Diego, and he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to go do this talk in Louisiana." He said, "I sure wish I was going there." I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going back east. My dad is dying." He said, "And I haven't been with him forever, and I don't know what to do." He said, "But it's going to be a long, sad trip." So anyway, I'm on that plane, and it's only a couple of hours from San Diego to Dallas, where we were both going to get off, and he was going to get on a connecting flight to where he was going, and I was going to get on a connecting flight. And as it turned out, as I was sitting there, I thought, what can I do for this guy? And I thought, it came to me, it just came to me. So when I got off the plane, I got the flight attendants and a couple of people, and I said, "Would you do me a favor?" What? They said, "Give me a marker. You got a marker?" So they gave me a marker, and I got a piece of cardboard, and I put his name on it, and I enlisted 8 or 10 people to stand there. When he got off the plane, we jumped up and down and welcomed him to Dallas. And he started laughing, he started laughing. It wasn't so bad anymore. So he took the sign and went on his way, gave me a hug. And then when he got back to San Diego, he called me. He said, "My mom found that sign. I tried to explain it to her." He said, "She just didn't get it, Just didn't get it." And that's the whole deal today. We don't get it. We just are so busy preoccupied with the nonsense, the tsunami, we just don't get it. There was a great cartoon in the paper about a week ago, and it showed 2 entrances for heaven. And the one entrance was really backed up, and the other entrance was hardly anybody there. And the entrance that was backed up had a sign above it that said, "The right religion." The one that wasn't backed up said, "The wrong religion." And there were 2 angels there, and the one angel says to the other angel, "I don't think they get it." And that's the way life is. We just don't get the joke. We're too busy being serious. We just don't get the joke. And the deal is it's all about perception. It's not about what's happening. It's what we think is happening. They always tell the story of the drunks that were in the bar, and they were talking about the fastest thing in the world. And the first drunk says, "Well, fastest thing in the world is blinking." He says, "You blink, you don't even know you're blinking." And they said, "Oh." So the second drunk said, "No, it's not blinking." He said, "It's thinking." He said, "Thoughts come into your head so fast you don't have time to even keep any of them out." And the third drunk said, "No." He said, "It's electricity. Electricity is the fastest thing in the world. You flip the switch on the wall, psst, it's there." So then they look at Wino Joe. And they said, "Wino Joe, what do you think?" He said, "Diarrhea." So, Wino Joe, diarrhea? Diarrhea. "How do you figure that?" He said, "Well, the other night, before I had time to wink, blink, or turn on the light, there you go." So it's perception. It's all perception. That's the way life is. In the 20s, there was nobody more recognized than Charlie Chaplin. He was the most recognized face in the world because he was in almost every other silent movie that was going on. So he was in Paris over Christmas, and he entered a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest. He came in third. People there thought there were 2 other people that were more like Charlie Chaplin than Charlie Chaplin, So when you think about your problems, which you shouldn't do, What you're worried about is all the stuff that, it's all made up. It's like guys having trouble doing the third step. You say, why are you having trouble? Well, I don't know if I can turn everything over. Well, let's read this little thing here. There is one who has all power. Now, if this entity has all power, which you say you believe, how much do you think is left for you? Let's look at this word here. It's all, all. Which part of this word is confusing you? Is it the or the what is it? What is it? If he has all the power, so you're worried about giving something up you don't have, in fear of the fact that somebody else might have it. That's what goes on. Then you have another guy say, Ken, if I keep giving up my will and my life to God, I'm going to become like the hole in the donut. Watch my lips, Sparky. We are the hole in the donut. And thank God we are, because donuts come and go, but the hole is always there, And it's that hole that connects us to the infinite. It's that hole that makes us whole, So if you want to be the donut, it's a very passing event, It's much better to be the hole, I have a little permanence, not a whole lot, a little more than the donut, though. And the deal is after a while you're here, and for you newcomers, this is probably the most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight, is you've got to learn to stop scratching shit that don't itch, because you'll be captivated with all day action, which will lead you nowhere. I'm going to tell you in the next few sentences who you really are. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is how we all started. Is you're trying to solve problems you don't have, so you can escape a reality you're not in. You want to change, but you're afraid. It's like wanting to steal second, but you don't want to leave first. We're over there to second. Yeah, that second's looking good, but I'm not leaving first, And the deal is here, if you can learn to leap before you look, just jump in there. By the time don't get into the thinking mode. People think that thinking is actually taking an action. Thinking is just thinking. It's like sitting in a car, the car's in park, and you're running the engine. Where are you going? Hey, I'm building up momentum. You're building up nothing. So learn to relax and learn to have a good time here. Hang out with other people who are as strange as you are. Hang out, form yourself a little posse where you all know the answer. You just don't know the question, and don't be a worry about what people call you. I was in New York when Malcolm X was doing all of the speaking there. And one day he said something that was very profound. And I thought, he said, it's not about what people call you. It's what you answer to. So don't answer to the nonsense. Don't answer to all that other nonsense. Be who, there was a guy who got me when I was newly sober, and he said something to me. And to this day, I think if someone had told me that when I was 8 or 10, my whole life would be different. And he said, Kenny, be what you is and not what you ain't. Because if you is what you ain't what you is. And I thought, gee, someone should have told me that. I was so busy being everything else, I forgot what I was. And now I get a chance to come here with you guys. It's like I'm looking at the sign when I'm sitting out there, and I'm thinking, the deal on the river, the river roundup, I'm from New York. Most of the guys go up the river, they're going to Osney and Attica, where are the boys going? They're away from home, And so I'm going to tell you this, and then I'm going to sit down, is that my mom, God love her, raised a bunch of kids, none of whom made it easy on her. She herself was raised in an orphanage and taken out of that orphanage by her aunt. She never had it easy in life. But my mom had a very firm grip on there is one who has all power. And she used to tell this story. And the story is just, I think it was an old story that she just made up. But it was about this boy, Johnny. And Johnny had polio. And back in the 40s and 50s, when you had polio, you just died. And she said, Johnny used to, before he had polio, he used to go to school in the morning, this parochial school. And if you ever know anything about parochial schools, they always have the school and the church right next to each other. It's a captive audience, you know. And he'd run into the church and he'd kneel down and he'd say, "Hello, God, this is Johnny. I just want to tell you I'm here." And he would do that after school and weekends and holidays and summers. And she said, finally, he developed polio and he was in a room and he was dying. And she said a voice was heard to say, "Hello, Johnny, this is God. I just want to tell you I'm here." And that's the voice that all of us need to hear, that we did not create ourselves. We were brought into this world for the sole purpose of doing whatever we were supposed to do. Through each and every one of us, God is trying to become something He's never been before. And our job is not to impede Him. And when we were practicing our acute alcoholism, we were impeding Him because we were trying to be something we were never meant to be by Him. And now we get to be that person, whatever that person is. And don't try to be like somebody else. Somebody else got to be like somebody else. You know, your job is to be just who you are. We love you just the way you are, you know. And when you look at the big picture, you know, you say to yourself, you have absolutely nothing to do, and you have all of eternity to get it done. So pace yourself, you know, just pace yourself. Don't start the morning with check-off list. And, you know, how does God talk to you if all day long you're on the phone, on the internet, on this, on that, making up a list? I mean, when's the be still part? When is the be still part? And practice being still and have a good time and live totally in the now. Totally in the now. Because that's where the game is played. You know, time is the most used noun in the English language. And people are always trying to save it. And then after a while, they save so much of it, they have to kill it. You know, it's like, and it doesn't exist. And when newcomers get with me and they say, "Ken, I have trouble with God," I say, "What's the problem?" They say, "I can't see it, touch it, feel it, taste it, or smell it, so I don't believe it exists." At which point, through my brilliance, I say, "What's telling you this?" My mind, which you cannot see, touch, taste, feel, or... So your mind, which doesn't exist, is telling you God doesn't exist. That usually buys them for about 6-7 minutes, you know. So you're saying it doesn't exist, you know? That's right, you know. So don't worry about it. Just go and have some fun, you know. Go and play with the kids. They know what's going on. Kids have the best sense of the present. You know, I was in an elevator with a kid and he was scratching his head. And I said, "Why are you scratching your head?" And he looked at me and he said, "Because I'm the only one knows it itches." You know? You would never get that result from an adult. They would say, "Well, I have this dermatology problem, and you know, and I'm using the wrong thing, but I've started using some new formula www." And kids don't think like that. Some of you came out to the International down at Seaport Village, and kids in San Diego fly kites down at that Seaport Village. And during June, they have what we call June gloom, where the clouds are really low. And I was walking along there one day, and I love to talk with kids because they got the best things to say. And this kid was flying a kite, and his kite was above the clouds. And I said to him, "How do you know your kite is still there?" And he looked at me and he said, "'Cause I can feel the pull of it, mister." And that's what AA is about, folks. It's feeling the pull of it. When you are doing God's will, you feel the pull of it. When you're not doing God's will, you feel the pull of that. You have no trouble separating what pull is pulling you. It's not that big of a deal. Our job is very simple here. It's really to take really good care of one another because we're only on loan. And God loves you, and I love you. And if you could just reach the point where you understood that there's nothing to understand, you know, just do it. Just do it. Don't try to figure it out. You know, don't try to figure it out. It's when you start thinking. Those 3 words are what get you in trouble. I've been thinking, you know. If you're a real alcoholic and you start that, you know, real alcoholics go to a funeral and they want to be the corpse. They go to a wedding and they want to be the bride, you know, and they want to be humble. Like, I really don't want to be noticed. I just want to be the center of attention. So our job, as I said, is to take really good care of one another. I want to thank you for letting me come here because every time I'm with you, I lose a little bit more of who I pretend to be. And that's really important to me because I have to do that on a daily basis. I have to recognize every day that I need you guys in my life. And if you want to get more out of meetings, just get more out of yourself. God bless you.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down. And then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. And if that shows up, the gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, And it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.